And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is June the 9th, the 160th day of this year. Just 205 days remaining to the year's over with, and we'll go do it again. Holidays observances. National Call Your Doctor Day. Annual reminder to schedule preventive medical appointments. National Strawberry Rhubarb Pie Day. And Donald Duck Day. In 1790, the Philadelphia Spelling Book became the first book copyrighted under the new U.S. Constitution. Well, and on that note, let us go see what stories we have in the news, because there's always something new going on. Well, Maine Democrats decide the fate of Senate candidate dogged by explosive allegations. You might say it's Judgment Day for Graham Plattner, the embattled Democratic Senate candidate in left-leaning Maine, who's aiming to oust longtime Republican Senator Susan Collins in a crucial race that's among a handful that will determine if GOP holds its slim Senate majority in the midterms. Plattner, an oyster farmer and military combat veteran, who is backed by Senator Bernie Sanders. Oh, that's a backing, don't you know? And other top progressive champions, is facing a slew of controversies. Can make his expected Democratic primary victory in Maine much more interesting than originally expected. And 1 week after President Trump's endorsement, the winning streak in high-profile Republican primaries was snapped. The president's clout over his party is facing another key test in South Carolina's GOP gubernatorial nomination face-off. Yes, Plattner, if you remember, is the one that has the Nazi tattoo on his chest. Well, President Trump drew a different reaction at the NBA Finals than he did at the CFP national title game. He received a massive reaction from a sold-out crowd at Madison Square Garden for Game 3 of the NBA Finals between the New York Knicks and San Antonio Spurs on Monday night. As the national anthem was being sung, he was shown on the Madison Square Garden, the big screen above the court. Got a mixed reaction from the crowd. Well, there was some cheering as he saluted the crowd with from his suite. The boos from those in attendance rang louder before the video panned back to NYPD officers holding flags on the court. President Trump was accompanied by his granddaughter, Kai Trump, who was on his right with her hand over her heart. Knicks owner James Doolin was also in the suite with Trump on his left when he was shown. Well, not everybody's liked by the population, and right now, with New York being the way it is, there's absolutely no telling how folks feel. Well, Vance refers Tim Walsh, Minnesota Attorney General, to the DOJ for criminal investigation over the state's alleged fraud. Vice President Vance Monday announced he had referred allegations involving Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison to the Justice Department Fraud Division for a potential criminal investigation over alleged fraud in federally funded social service programs. He made that announcement during an appearance on Fox News' Jesse Waters Primetime. He was asked about a report released by the House Oversight Committee alleging that state officials, including Walsh and Ellison, were warned of fraud in the state but didn't take action to stop it, in part because of litigation threats and concerns about being accused of discrimination. Yes, we must be very, very aware of the potential of being accused of being discriminatory. Well, the L.A. mayoral race heads to November runoff as Karen Bass faces a Mandami-style socialist. Los Angeles City Councilwoman Nithya Raman advanced Monday evening to a runoff election against Mayor Karen Bass in a heated race that has garnered national attention. That outcome sets up a general election that pits Bass, an incumbent, fending off criticism over her record against Raman's progressive message of government-led affordability measures. And that result means that Spencer Pratt, a Republican and former The Hills reality TV star, is out of the race. That's according to the Associated Press. Voters will decide the overall winner on November 3rd. Yet this part of the problem is that there are so many who are just enamored with the socialist message. They don't stop to think about reality. We're seeing a lot of that in New York City right now. Yeah. President Trump has vowed total victory over Iran within weeks as Netanyahu confirms the ceasefire. Iran and Israel exchanged missiles Sunday night, shattering President Trump's ceasefire and putting peace talks in doubt. Iran launched missiles into Israel after the IDF carried out strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon this weekend. Israel retaliated with its own strikes on Tehran, targeting military infrastructure and missile production facilities. And President Trump has demanded that all sides stop shooting. President Trump warned Prime Minister Netanyahu that escalating military action could leave Israel isolated in the conflict with Iran. And President Trump said he scaled back the scope of an Israeli attack on Iran after Middle Eastern countries urged him to push Prime Minister Netanyahu toward diplomacy. Iran announced plans for a new resistance security corridor stretching from the Strait of Hormuz into the Bab el-Mandab Strait. We'll see how any of that plays out. Well, American Airlines flight attendant was killed in a tourist hotspot as investigators probe a suspected boat strike. Body of a woman found on a Florida beach last week has been identified as an American Airlines flight attendant who died after an apparent boat strike while snorkeling. Kelly Melinda Williams' remains were discovered by two fishermen in the surf near Hollywood Beach about 8 p.m. June 3rd, according to CBS Miami. Authorities reportedly said the 31-year-old flight attendant showed injuries consistent with a vessel hitting her, and determined her cause of death was blunt force injuries. And based on the investigation, it appears the deceased was snorkeling or diving in the area of Dr. Von D. Mitchell Hulu Johnson State Park during the day of June 3rd, according to Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation agents. FWC investigators are working in partnership with Hollywood detectives on this case. Details regarding the suspected boat involved in Williams' death, or if any suspects have been identified, haven't been released. The investigation is continuing. Well, a repeat offender on probation killed a father who tracked his stolen truck using a GPS. Father in Houston, Texas, was killed during a carjacking Saturday afternoon, and a repeat offender on probation has been charged with his murder. Yes, when judges finally understand that guilty means guilty, and you don't let them out if they promise to be a good boy, we'll see a lessening of these murders. The Harris County Sheriff's Office said in a news release that the owner of the stolen car, identified as 56-year-old Louis Arabia, tracked down the vehicle and confronted the person accused of stealing it, London Hogan Sr. During that confrontation, Hogan shot and killed Arabia, who was pronounced dead after being taken to a local hospital. Hogan Sr. is also accused of shooting another man who's expected to survive. Harris County Sheriff's Office told Fox 26 that Arabia's son was putting gas into the Chevy Silverado when Hogan allegedly pulled on a gun and took the pickup truck. Arabia and a friend tracked the pickup truck using GPS, which led them to the area where it was being driven. The car has been driven by Arabia and was involved in a collision with the stolen Chevy Silverado, which disabled it. According to the sheriff's office, Arabia chased a male and female suspect who got out of the stolen truck. And deputies said Edwards and Hogan fired multiple shots. He's being charged with murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. He's got a lengthy criminal history, which includes, in November 2023, assault of a family household member impeding breath or circulation. He was given a deferred adjudication, resulting in 5 years of community supervision. He promised to be a good boy, and the judge said, "Oh, well, if you make that promise, then that's okay." September 3rd, 2020, he was charged as being a felon in possession of a weapon. That one was dismissed. September 3rd, 2020, he was charged with unauthorized use of a vehicle, which was also dismissed. September 3rd, 2020, possession of a controlled substance, which was dismissed. August 24, 2016, possession of a controlled substance. He was found guilty of that one. October 15, 2015, possession of a controlled substance, found guilty. December 16, 2009, burglary, found guilty. There's a long, continuing list of violations for which, basically, if he promised to be a good boy, it was okay. Well, let's see. My system just had a nervous breakdown. Let's try one more time here. Well, Carmelo Anthony, just found out a few minutes ago, was found guilty. But experts say jurors may have misunderstood key facts in that murder trial. Larry Taylor, a former Texas prosecutor, says jurors will evaluate far more than physical evidence in that stabbing case. Defense attorneys rested their case yesterday without calling Carmelo Anthony to testify, leaving jurors to decide his self-defense claim without hearing directly from the teenager accused of fatally stabbing Austin Metcalf. Court adjourned for the day Monday afternoon. Closing arguments are scheduled to begin today before the case is eventually handed to the jury for deliberations. But I saw a notification a few minutes ago that said he had been found guilty. All right. Navy sailors admitted killing a fellow service member as a mother questions missed warning signs. Navy sailor admitted Monday to strangling a fellow sailor, 21-year-old Angelina Resendez, inside his barracks room last year, bringing what her mother described as a peace of mind while renewing questions from Resendez's family and advocates about whether military leaders missed opportunities to intervene before the killing. Esme Castle, whose daughter was found dead in a wooded area in Norfolk, about 10 miles from Naval Station Norfolk in June of 2025, told Fox News that hearing Jeremiah Copeland admit responsibility in court answered lingering questions about how her daughter died. But she said she believes the killing could have been prevented. According to the U.S. Navy News, Copeland pleaded guilty during a general court-martial Monday to the unpremeditated murder of culinary specialist third-class Angelina Resendez. Was making a false official statement, aggravated assault involving a second victim, and indecent recording involving a third victim. During the hearing, Copeland admitted to strangling Resendez May 29, 2025, telling the military judge, "I killed CS3 Resendez May 29th. I strangled her with my bare hands," according to the U.S. Navy News. Although the medical examiner previously ruled her death, cause of her death was undetermined, Copeland admitted in court he strangled her, according to the news report. Also, according to Copeland, Resendez came to his barracks room on May 29th, where the two drank alcohol and kissed before she became upset after seeing something on his phone. Copeland admitted in court that the strangled Resendez while trying to keep her from attracting the attention of other sailors. Under the plea agreement, Copeland faces a minimum of 40 years in prison dishonorable discharge from the Navy, forfeiture of all pay and allowance, and a reduction in rank. Also be required to register as a sex offender. Castle said hearing the admission brought peace of mind after more than a year of uncertainty. Well, some of the soldiers I've associated with in the military were one step short of being murderers themselves, but we were able to anticipate in many cases, not every case, but in many cases, when they were going to go off the rails. Well, there's been a new safety recall. Kia recalls 6,000 vehicles due to a possible seatbelt defect that could raise the possibility of injury. Recall potentially affected 6,264 2027 Kia Telluride and Kia Telluride hybrid models. The recall potentially affected these vehicles according to a notice from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. The affected vehicles included 4,367 Telluride hybrid models manufactured from March 24 to May 12, 2026, and 1,897 gas-powered Telluride models manufactured from March 24 to May 10, 2026. Kia learned that the driver's seatbelt emergency locking retractor may lock when the driver attempts to extend the seatbelt webbing in certain Kia Telluride vehicles, preventing the seatbelt strap from extending, according to the notice. Well, a lot of the newer vehicles are so sophisticated that sometimes very basic things have issues. Well, U.S. Army helicopter's gone down, but President Trump says the pilots are fine. The U.S. Army Apache helicopter went down near the Strait of Hormuz on Monday, and the individuals crewing the craft were rescued. That's going to the New York Times, citing 2 individuals briefed on the episode. President Trump said this morning the pilots are fine, nobody was injured. I'm going to issue a report about it tomorrow, he said. Fox News Digital reached out to U.S. Central Command on Tuesday morning. U.S. is continuing to conduct a blockade against the Islamic Republic of Iran. And U.S. forces disabled an unladen oil tanker in the Gulf of Oman June 8th after the vessel violated the ongoing blockade against Iran by attempting to sail to an Iranian port. And the U.S. Central Command disabled Palu-flagged MT Marivex as it transited international waters in the Gulf of Oman, heading toward Iran. A FA-18 Super Hornet from USS Abraham Lincoln fired a precision munition into the ship's engineering and steering spaces after the crew failed to comply with directions from U.S. forces. The Marivex is no longer sailing toward Iran. Well, GOP senators rally around a new DHS proposal targeting sanctuary cities. The Republican senators signaled support for imposing consequences on sanctuary cities after Homeland Security Secretary Markwayne Mullin floated a proposal to pull Customs and Border Protection officers from airports and jurisdictions that refuse to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. He said, I think there should be consequences to cities and states that undercut federal law, according to Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina. I think they ought to pay a price for what they do, and I agree with what he's doing. Mullins has framed the proposal as a response to sanctuary cities that are limiting or refusing cooperation with immigration and customs enforcement and deputies over immigration enforcement funding. Well, the sanctuary cities have to learn that come on down, Joe Biden is not in charge anymore. Well, from Hunter Biden laptop to Kamala Harris edits, there's a long history of 60-minute controversies. Former 60 Minutes correspondent Scott Paley accused CBS News leadership of political bias and incompetence on Sunday in his first sit-down interview since he was fired from the network last week after clashing with new management. Paley spent 37 years at CBS News, said the turmoil began after CBS dismissed several senior 60 Minutes staffers and installed journalist Nick Bilton as the program's new executive producer under CBS News editor-in-chief Barry Weiss. During the emotional interview, he not only insisted Weiss put her thumb on the scale for President Trump, but also pushed back on the notion that 60 Minutes is biased against conservatives. Well, they've always been biased against conservatives. Well, former Prince Andrew has been spotted with a bruise covering half his face as the mystery injury sparks questions. Striking bruise covering part of former Prince Andrew's face has sparked questions after new photos showed the ex-royal near his home. The 66-year-old was behind the wheel near his Marsh Farm residence on the Sandringham estate when photographers captured the purple mark stretching from his right temple to his cheek. Source close to the former Duke of York told UK's Daily Mail the prominent patch is not a cause for concern. There's been no drama. Insider declined to provide further details, citing medical confidentiality. Buckingham Palace doesn't speak on Andrew's behalf because he's no longer a working royal. And the peanut gallery is tuning up. Well, a Wisconsin teen has been sentenced to life in the brutal slaying of a 5-year-old boy found in a dumpster. 18-year-old Wisconsin man was sentenced Friday to life in prison for his role in the brutal killing of a 5-year-old Milwaukee boy whose disappearance later led to charges and changes in state law. Eric Mendoza was 15 at the time of the crime, will not be eligible to petition for release for 50 years. Of course, some well-meaning judge will let him out for combing his hair or doing something else that's considered showing he's changed his attitude. He pled guilty in February to first-degree intentional homicide, hiding a corpse, and 3 counts of second-degree recklessly endangering safety in the death of Prince McCree, according to local outlets Fox 6 and WISN. When considering the serious nature of this defendant's offenses, it doesn't get much more serious, more egregious than this, according to Milwaukee County Assistant District Attorney Matthew Torbenson. McCree was reported missing October 25, 2023, after his mother allowed him to go play video games in the basement of the home where his family lived, where David Pitura, who was later sentenced to life in prison in the case, also lived. When she couldn't find him later that day, she contacted the police. Next morning, authorities found the child's body in a dumpster near North 55th Street and West Vliet Street, a mile from his home. Investigators said Mendoza admitted to choking McCree and striking him multiple times with a golf club. Court records allege Mendoza and accomplice Pitura later disposed of the boy's body. Surveillance video cited in court filings showed the pair carrying a white garbage bag through an alley on the day McCree disappeared. Prosecutors said Pitura initially told investigators he and Mendoza had gone for a walk, but cell phone GPS data contradicted his account. Later directed police to the location of the body. Well, our topic for today, we've been talking about UFOs and things like that. Today we're going to talk about some of the world's strangest mysteries. You know, the Earth's not always the still, solid place that we imagine. Beneath our feet, it moves and shifts and breathes and sometimes behaves in ways that seem almost alive. All around the world, landscapes act with a strange kind of motion and rhythm that quite often surprises anybody who sees them. In the Atacama Desert, patterns in the sand appear and vanish overnight as if the ground rearranges itself when nobody's watching. In Indonesia, entire islands have slipped beneath the sea after volcanic eruptions reshaped the land. In Alaska, frozen ground known as permafrost rises and sinks with the seasons. making the earth itself heave like a sleeping creature. And even in the deserts of the Middle East, mysterious singing dunes vibrate and hum, producing deep musical notes when the sand slides. And these unusual behaviors remind us the planet's never truly quiet, stretching, contracting, and melting, crackling, and reforming in endless cycles. We're going to talk about some of the strangest examples of an Earth that refuses to sit still. We're going to talk about shifting landscapes and living geology and disappearing ground that reveals a world full of motion and mystery. Well, some islands show up on maps and stay there forever. Others don't. Off the coast of places like Mexico, India, and even the Pacific Northwest, sailors have reported a strange kind of landform when it pops out of the ocean like a secret and slips back beneath the waves as if it was never there. These ghost islands, as they're called, have been confusing explorers for centuries. On any particular day, a crew might spot a dark shape rising above the water, big enough to land a small boat on. Next day, the sea looks calm again, empty, no island in sight. Well, part of the answer to the question of what's happening lies deep below the surface. Some parts of the world, underwater volcanoes constantly rumble and shift. When they push debris upward, such as ash and rock and bubbling gas, they can form a temporary island. And for a moment, it's actually real land, solid, visible. But once the pressure changes, the whole thing collapses and sinks back beneath the sea. The Mystery Islands are born from sandbanks that move like living creatures. Strong currents pile sand into giant underwater hills. When the tides are low, the hills poke above the waters. When the tides rise, they vanish. Old maps list dozens of these so-called lost islands, marked by frustrated cartographers who weren't sure what they had found. But the strangest cases are the ones witnesses swear are real, complete with trees and shorelines and even birds. But were never seen again. Were they tricks of the light, mirage reflections, mistaken locations? Well, nobody really knows for sure. What we do know is the ocean is a shapeshifter. Sometimes it builds an island just to erase it, leaving behind nothing but questions and an empty stretch of sea. Let's talk about the island of Brazil. For centuries, a small island in the North Atlantic has puzzled sailors and map makers and storytellers. And it's sometimes marked on an old chart, sometimes left out entirely, has a habit of appearing and vanishing without warning. Some folks call it Brazil. Others use names like Brazil or Brazil. And a few early maps simply marked it with a small round shape and a hesitant label, as if the cartographer wasn't sure whether it truly belonged there or not. What makes that island so fascinating is not just its mystery, but how many people across many centuries believe it was real enough to chase. Well, the earliest hints of Brazil show up in medieval Irish legends. In those stories, the island wasn't just a place of land, but a place wrapped in magic. Stories said it was hidden by a thick enchanted mist that cleared only once every 7 years. And when that fog lifted, the island would shine like an emerald in the sea, lush and green and untouched by time. Some stories described it as a home for wise ancient beings. and said it was a place of perfect happiness, a land where sickness and sorrow didn't exist. In an age when myth and geography often blurred together, it's not surprising people wondered whether such a place might just be more than a story. By the 1300s and 1400s, something unusual happened. The island began to appear on real maps. Well-known charts like the Catalan Atlas and the maps of Italian and Portuguese navigators placed High Brazil as a round, solid-looking island west of Ireland. These weren't whimsical drawings. They were serious navigational tools meant to guide ships across dangerous waters. For a lot of map makers to include it, they must have heard from sailors who swore they saw it. And over the centuries, reports came from captains who claimed they glimpsed an unfamiliar landmass rising on the horizon, just where the map said it ought to be. One of the most persistent themes in these sightings was how the island seemed to vanish when approached. The crew might see it clearly from a distance, green fields and rocky cliffs and even smoke rising when it looked like dwellings, but as their ship got closer, the island would sink into the mist or fade into the waves. A lot of explorers tried to reach it and returned frustrated, insisting that they sail straight toward it only to find empty ocean. Now, a few sailors, of course, blamed the empty fog. Others spoke in hushed tones about illusions or magic. And regardless of the explanation, the island's ability to appear solid but remain unreachable only strengthened its reputation. One of the most detailed stories came from the 17th century from an Irish sea captain named John Nisbet. According to his account, he was on a routine voyage when his ship drifted into a heavy fog. After hours of moving slowly through the mist, the fog suddenly lifted, revealing a large island dead ahead. He described the island as green and peaceful, almost too perfect to be real. He claimed small boats rowed out to meet his ship, and island's inhabitants were friendly and generous, offering food and information. And his crew supposedly spent time ashore, exploring stone buildings and grassy fields and a quiet village. When he returned to Ireland and shared his story, another captain retraced his route and insisted he saw that same island. And these stories, while impossible to verify, spread quickly and kept the mystery alive. As the centuries passed and the age of exploration filled in more and more of the world's map, High Brazil began to fade from official charts. By the 1800s, it was rarely included anymore, though reference to it continued in folklore and in the private journals of curious sailors. People began to wonder whether the island ever really truly existed, and if it did exist, where'd it go? Why'd nobody found it again? Well, modern explanations try to answer those questions without relying on the supernatural. One scientific idea involves a natural optical illusion called a superior mirage. When layers of warm and cold air stack, they can bend light in strange ways. Distant coastlines or islands can appear to float in midair or seem much closer than they really are. In the right conditions, a small part of Ireland's western coastline could easily create the illusion of a circular island far out to sea. To sailors unfamiliar with atmospheric tricks, this could look like a mysterious land rising where no land should be. And another theory suggests the island may once have been real, but was since disappeared. The North Atlantic is geologically active with underwater volcanoes and seamounts and shifting terrain. Some volcanic islands rise suddenly, sometimes overnight, only to crumble back beneath the waves within months or years. Other landforms, like sandbars or small rocky islets, can erode and sink over centuries. And it is possible that the High Brazil began as a genuine island or a large shoal that early sailors encountered, but storms and erosion or tectonic movement eventually destroyed it. And if that's the case, the sightings might have been real at first, with later sailors chasing a land that no longer existed. Of course, the stories about the natives on the island a little bit harder to explain. And of course, not everybody accepts the scientific explanations, but that is part of the island's lasting charm. Some people still believe High Brazil was a supernatural place, a sort of Atlantic Atlantis that appears only to the lucky or to the gifted. Others link it to Arthurian legends or claim it may have been home to advanced ancient culture. These theories continue to appear in novels and documentaries and speculative articles because the idea of an elusive island hiding just out of reach is very hard to resist. Well, let's talk about lakes that come back from the dead. Well, these are places in the world where lakes seem to behave like living creatures. They come and they go, and they swell into wide blue expanses and then shrink into nothing but cracked earth and dust. And to people who live nearby, these lakes can appear to die and then return almost as if they're resurrecting themselves. Our idea of a lake that comes back from the dead describes a very real natural phenomena, one that occurs when a body of water disappears completely for weeks or months or even years, only to return in full force as if it had never vanished. These lakes don't fit neatly into the usual category of geography. They shift and they breathe in rhythm with weather, climate, and geological forces hidden deep underground. Let's talk about Lake Erie. One of the most dramatic examples of a lake that vanishes and reappears is Lake Erie in South Australia. Known today by its indigenous name, Kaditanda, Lake Erie is an enormous basin that sits in the lowest part of the Australian continent, surrounded by thousands of miles of dry, reddish land. Most of the time, Kaditanda looks like something out of a desert dreamscape, shivering salt flats so bright it hurts the eyes. White plate of crusted mineral stretching across the horizon. No water to be seen. No glimmer of blue, nothing to suggest this place could ever become a lake. But in rare years when heavy rainfall falls far to the north, rivers surge and floodwaters spill across the desert, eventually reaching the basin. And when this happens, the salt it transforms almost overnight into a vast inland sea. Birds that vanish from the region return in great flocks. Plants that have remained dormant burst into color. Fishermen paddle in waters that only weeks before were dry enough to walk on. And when the rain stops, the water evaporates under the intense Australian heat, and the lake vanishes once again. To the people who witness it, Kaditanda seems to come back from the dead over and over. It never rests. Well, let's talk about Badwater Basin. This is in the American Southwest. It's in Death Valley, one of the hottest places on the planet. And most of the time, Badwater's a cracked desert floor, the ground split into hexagonal patterns by years of drying and shrinking. And the field's as permanent as stone, but on rare occasions, a series of storms dumps enormous amounts of water into the region. The ground can't absorb the water quickly enough, and a lake begins to form. Shallow, but expansive. It stretches across the desert floor, reflecting the mountains like a giant mirror. Photographers flock to capture the surreal sight of water in a place where temperatures often exceed 120 degrees. After a few days or weeks, the water evaporates, leaving behind only salt deposits and the memory of a lake that briefly came back to life. People who return after the water's gone often have trouble believing the lake ever existed at all. Well, from Death Valley, let's go to the American state of Oregon. A place known as Lost Lake. Famously drains away each year through a large hole in its floor. And the hole is actually a lava tube, kind of geological drain pipe formed thousands of years ago by volcanic activity. And during the dry season, the water levels drop until the entire lake disappears, leaving behind only a meadow of dry grasses and scattered stones. And when the rainy season returns, the surrounding snow begins to melt. Lost Lake fills up again, covering the lava tube and restoring the calm blue surface that the hikers recognize. To people who see it for the first time, the disappearance is shocking, almost eerie. Feels like watching the lake die only to see it return whole and unchanged months later. Well, let's talk about Lake Nagami, probably the most famous lake that comes back from the dead. It sits in the African Rift Valley in Botswana. In the 1800s, European explorers described it as a massive shimmering lake surrounded by wildlife. But in the decades that followed, the lake went through unpredictable cycles. Sometimes it expanded into wetlands and stretched for miles. Other times it dried out completely, leaving nothing but grassy plains. Reports from travelers contradicted one another so wildly that some believed the lake itself was migrating or even hiding. In reality, shifts in river flow and rainfall patterns control the lake's existence, causing it to alternate between life and vanishing completely. Well, not all lakes that vanish and reappear do so because of rainfall patterns. Some depend on hidden movement of groundwater beneath the Earth's surface. In certain regions, lakes are fed not by rivers or streams, but by underground aquifers that rise and fall with changes in climate. When the aquifer is full, the lake expands. When drought strikes and the aquifer empties, the lake shrinks or disappears completely. One example of this occurs in parts of East Africa, where shallow alkaline lakes can vanish almost completely during long dry spells. Months or years later, when underground water returns, the lakes refill, sometimes so quickly that shorelines change dramatically in a single week. Villagers had built their homes far from the water suddenly find themselves at the water's edge. Others watch the lake retreat beyond the horizon. These lakes feel unpredictable, almost alive, as if they follow rules known only to themselves. Now, another place that's got disappearing lakes is Iceland. And it actually has another kind of disappearing lake, one shaped by ice and volcanic forces rather than heat or drought. The volcanic highlands, these are glacial lakes that form behind natural ice dams. When pressure from meltwater becomes too great, the ice dam gives way and the lake drains suddenly in a violent rush. And the empty basin can remain dry for months or even years, looking like nothing more than a rocky depression. Then as the glacier shifts and the meltwater collects again, the lake reforms. The cycle repeats over and over, a rhythmic pattern of destruction and renewal. These lakes can vanish overnight and return just as quickly, baffling early travelers who believed they had stumbled upon a supernatural event. Well, from Iceland, let's go to the deserts in the Middle East. Some parts of the world, lakes vanish not because the water escapes, but because sand and soil swallow them up. In the deserts of the Middle East, there are seasonal lakes that form after sudden downpours, filling dry wadis with water. These lakes can appear large and deep, attracting herds of animals and migrating birds. But beneath the surface lies extremely porous ground capable of absorbing entire lakes in a matter of days. The water sinks rapidly into the earth, vanishing as though drained by an invisible plug. A traveler who passes through the wadi a week later might only find dry soil and cracked mud, but there being no sign the lake was ever there. That cycle of dramatic appearance and quiet disappearance gives these lakes a almost ghostly quality. Lakes that vanish and return remind us of how dynamic the planet truly is. The ground beneath us isn't fixed, and water doesn't obey simple rules. Climate, geology, and weather combine to create places where nature behaves in startling, almost magical ways. Early explorers, a lake that appears one year and vanishes the next seems like a living thing with moods and secrets. Even today, with satellites and scientific measurement, these lakes actually hold a sense of wonder. They show the world is full of landscapes that can't be understood at a glance, and that some places, whether in deserts, mountains, or volcanic plains, are always in the process of becoming something new. Well, from appearing and disappearing lakes, let's talk about cliffs that breathe like giant lungs. These are cliffs that behave like they are alive. They move, they heave, they sigh, they exhale gusts of wind strong enough to lift dust from the ground. Then moments later, they inhale again, pulling air inward with an almost unsettling force. And if somebody's standing nearby, it feels as if the entire rock face is breathing, like a giant chest expanding and contracting. Now, this may sound like legend or maybe folklore, but it's rooted in real geological processes. When people talk about a cliff that breathes like a giant lung, they usually refer to a rare natural phenomenon in which a entire rock formation takes in and releases air because the pressure changes deep inside. These cliffs don't actually live, but they behave in ways that seem incredibly lifelike. One of the best known examples of this strange behavior can be found in the American Southwest. And that's a region full of slot canyons and sandstone walls and porous rock formations. Places like Utah's San Rafael Swell or parts of Navajo sandstone country. Hikers sometimes report sudden blasts of warm air coming from cracks in canyon walls. A moment later, when the temperature shifts or the wind outside changes direction, that same crack begins to suck air inward with a deep, steady pull. And that force can be strong enough to rustle shirts and flutter hats and push sand across the ground. And scientists who study desert geology explain these cliffs are full of narrow passages and hidden chambers and pockets of air that expand and contract depending on the temperature. When the rock heats up in the sun, the air inside expands and escapes through cracks. When the rock cools quickly, especially at sunset, the air inside contracts and pulls outside air back in. The result feels uncannily like the cliff is inhaling and exhaling. Well, this process can happen on a much larger scale in places with vast cave systems hidden behind a cliff face. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, for example, is well known for its breathing entrances. Although these aren't exactly cliffs, the stone walls around the openings have behaved the same way. In summer, warm air flows into the cave as if the earth was breathing. In winter, when the cave air is warmer than the freezing air outside, massive gusts roar out of the entrances. Early settlers described it as the cave sighing, as if it had lungs the size of mountains. Modern scientists now understand the movement comes from pressure differences between the cave systems and the outside world. The underground air is warmer or cooler than the air above ground. It produces strong flows to equalize the pressure. A cliff with a cave network inside can behave the same way. The entire face may release steady blasts of wind one day and draw air into the next, depending on weather and temperature and atmospheric pressure. Well, let's talk about the Isle of Staffa. Well, that remarkable example occurs along coastal cliffs where sea caves tunnel deep into the rock. The breathing rock on the Isle of Staffa in Scotland offers a dramatic illustration. Although the island is better known for Fingal's Cave and its famous basalt columns, there are smaller side caves where waves push air into cracks and chambers. When a large wave enters the chamber, it encompasses the trapped air, forcing it outward through openings in the cliff. When the wave retreats, the pressure drops and the cliff pulls the air back in. Visitors sometimes describe the effect as the cliff panting, as if the sea has given it life. While this breathing is powered by ocean waves rather than internal temperature changes, the sensation is the same thing. The cliff seems to inhale and exhale, making deep rhythmic sounds that echoes across the rocks. Let's talk about the Kiama blowhole, one of the most dramatic versions of a breathing cliff. It can be found in places with blowholes where the ocean forces air and water through vertical shafts in the rock. The Kiama blowhole in Australia is famous for blasting columns of water into the air, but it also breathes between eruptions. When a wave enters the sea cave beneath the blowhole, it forces air violently upward through the shaft. Upon retreat, the air inside is sucked downward. If you stand near the rock where the tides are right, you can feel the air surge and withdraw again in a steady rhythm. The cliff seems to pulse, alive with the motion of the sea. In some mountainous parts of the world, cliffs breathe because of seasonal freezing and thawing. Limestone regions like the Alps or the Carpathians, they're cliffs, riddled with tiny passages and hidden caves where moist air circulates constantly. In winter, when the rock cools rapidly at night, the air inside contracts and the air from the outside gets sucked in. During the day, sunlight warms the cliffs enough to reverse the direction of the flow. Climbers in places like Dockstein Mountains in Austria have reported feeling sudden gusts of warm air blasting from cracks in the rock, only to feel cold inward drafts a few hours later. The shift can be startling, especially when the cliff emits deep groaning noises at the same time. These sounds come from thermal expansion and contraction in the rock, which can cause it to creak and pop and rumble like a living organism. What makes these cliffs feel especially alive is the sounds they produce. A breathing cliff doesn't do so silently. Utah's desert canyons, for example, the escaping air can whistle and hum or roar. In coastal environments, the breath may be accompanied by booming echoes or hollow sighs that carry across the water. Inland cliffs with deep cave systems sometimes groan like enormous doors opening and closing. These sounds are caused by moving air striking irregular surfaces inside the rock. Similar to wind blowing across the mouth of a bottle, but on a far grander scale. Early travelers often thought these noises were signs of spirits or underground monsters. Even today, standing near a cliff that suddenly exhales a warm gust of air can be unsettling, as though something ancient and hidden is awakened inside the stone. Well, scientists can see these breathing cliffs as natural pressure valves. Rock formations, especially those made of sandstone or limestone, are far more porous than they appear. They contain networks of cracks and holes and channels carved by water, erosion, or volcanic activity. And these internal spaces hold air that reacts to temperature shifts and pressure changes. When outside conditions change rapidly, such as at sunset or during storms, or when waves crash into sea caves, the rock releases or absorbs air to maintain equilibrium. What humans interpret as breathing is simply air moving through the rock, but the effect is so rhythmic and powerful it resembles the lungs of a massive creature. And there's something undeniably poetic about the idea of a cliff breathing. It blurs the lines between the living and the non-living world, reminding us that landscapes are never truly still. A cliff may seem solid and eternal, but it's constantly responding to invisible forces around it. It warms and it cools and it expands and contracts. It pulls in air and pushes it back out. It reacts to tides and storms and seizes with movements too slow or subtle for most people to notice, except during those rare moments when the effect becomes impossible to ignore. Well, there are moments when the earth reminds us how thin the line is between the solid ground we trust and the hidden world beneath it. One day everything looks normal. A road, a field, a backyard. Next morning the surface is torn open, leaving a dark pit where level ground once was. People describe this as the ground that opens overnight. And while it sounds like something out of a myth or a ghost story, it's a very real natural phenomena. These sudden openings usually take the form of sinkholes, but they can also be caused by collapsing lava tubes and melting permafrost and abandoned mines or hidden pockets of underground water that slowly carve away the earth until nothing is left to hold the surface up. What makes these events so unsettling is how fast they can happen. The ground doesn't warn us loudly, it simply just lets go. One of the most famous examples occurred in 2010 in Guatemala City, when a perfectly round sinkhole opened up under a busy neighborhood, plunged 300 feet straight down and swallowed a 3-story building. The hole formed so quickly that residents described hearing a loud rumble and then seeing the ground just vanish as though a trap door had opened up. Scientists explain that leaking water pipes and unstable volcanic ash beneath the city had gradually hollowed out a vast underground space. But the sudden final collapse was as shocking as it could be, even to the experts. Overnight, a quiet street turned into a vertical chasm wide enough to fill a house. Another well-known example comes from Florida, a state that experiences more sinkholes than nearly any place else in the world. Florida's landscape sits on top of a thick layer of limestone, a type of rock that dissolves slowly in water. Rainwater, slightly acidic after mixing with carbon dioxide in the air, seeps into the ground and carves passages through the limestone. Over decades, underground rooms and tunnels form beneath the surface. As long as the ceilings of these spaces remain thick enough, the land above stays stable. But eventually the roof becomes too thin to support the weight of soil and roads and buildings, and that's when the surface collapses, and often it happens quite suddenly. 2013, a man in Seffner, Florida was at home when the ground beneath his bedroom opened up and pulled him into a deep sinkhole. From the outside, the house looked normal. No cracks, no sinking, no warning, but in an instant, Jeffrey Bush, 36 years old, vanished. And due to the unstable ground, his body was never recovered. The house was eventually demolished, and when the site became a painful reminder for his family, especially his brother Jeremy Bush, who had tried to save him. And while Florida sinkholes are caused by dissolving rock, the ground opening overnight can take different forms in volcanic regions. In Hawaii, parts of the Big Island sit above networks of old lava tubes. Tunnels left behind when molten lava flowed underground while the surface cooled and hardened. When a lava tube roof becomes thin from age, erosion, or pressure, it can collapse suddenly. Hikers sometimes find that a stable-looking patch of forest floor is dropped into a hidden chamber below. 2018, near Pahoa, field collapsed into a 40-foot section of an ancient lava tube after the volcanic eruption changed underground pressures. A resident walking his property discovered the hole one morning where the ground had been solid the day before. He's lucky he didn't wind up in it. In northern regions, thawing permafrost produces its own version of the earth opening up suddenly. Permafrost is soil that stays frozen year-round, sometimes for thousands of years. When rising temperatures melt the ice within the soil, the ground becomes unstable. Entire patches of forest in Siberia have dropped into newly formed pits caused by rapid thawing. 2014, the famous Yamal crater appeared on the Yamal Peninsula in Russia. Helicopter pilots spotted a circular deep hole that had not been there the previous season. Many early theories sounded sensational, but researchers eventually connected it to melting permafrost that allowed pockets of trapped gas to explode upward, leaving a gaping crater behind. Villagers living nearby reported hearing booms in the night, but they didn't see the hole until daylight. This part of the world, the landscape itself has begun to shift, and holes can form startlingly fast. Even forests can experience sudden collapses. In parts of Canada and Alaska, patches of boreal forest have been known to sink when melting ice beneath the roots gives way. The trees, still upright, tilt at odd angles, creating drunken forest. Although this movement is usually gradual, in some cases the ground can slump abruptly, transforming stable terrain into a jumbled landscape of crooked trees almost overnight. Human activity also plays a role in sudden ground collapses. Mining towns, for example, are notorious for unexpected cave-ins. As miners extract valuable materials from the earth, they create empty chambers. If these chambers aren't properly supported, the ground above can collapse decades later. In 2019, a sinkhole appeared in the town of Pingxi in Taiwan, swallowing part of a road. Investigators discovered that the region's old coal mines, abandoned long ago, had weakened the ground. The collapse happened overnight, catching residents by complete surprise. Similarly, cities with old water infrastructure are at risk. When underground pipes leak for long periods, the water slowly washes away soil and weakens the ground. And this is believed to be part of what caused the giant sinkhole to appear in Guatemala City. Other places, broken sewer lines or storm drains can trigger collapse. In 2020, in South London, quiet residential street suddenly split open. Residents woke up to find a 15-foot deep hole where parked cars had been standing. Heavy rain combined with a damaged sewer pipe created conditions that eroded the ground below and could no longer support the pavement. And everything went crash. There are also natural formations called karst landscapes, where streams disappear into caves and underground rivers carve intricate networks of passages through soft rock. And these landscapes exist in many parts of the world, including China's Guian region, parts of Vietnam, Kentucky in the U.S., and large stretches of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. In these regions, sinkholes are part of the natural life cycle of the land. In 2022, a massive sinkhole developed in Puebla, Mexico. Expanded so quickly that the family watched their entire yard vanish within days. At the end of the week, the hole reached over 100 meters across. Family reported small cracks in the ground one day and a full collapse shortly after that. Geologists who studied the site found evidence of underground water eroding layers of soft volcanic ash. Yucatan Peninsula is especially famous for its cenotes, natural sinkholes that connect to vast underground rivers. Some cenotes are hundreds of feet deep. Many of these openings formed long ago, but new ones still appear unexpectedly. Farmers sometimes wake up to find the land where they planted crops had dropped into a clear pool of blue groundwater. And because the region's limestone dissolves easily, these openings can form with very little warning. And on that note, we've come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow and talk about more of the Earth's strangest mysteries. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.